So, okay, super interesting lens to check out today. I've had this. This is the Panasonic Lumix 100 to 500mm f5 to 7.1. There's a lot of reasons I actually think this is really interesting. I wasn't really expecting to see a lens like this from Panasonic Lumix. It kind of came as a bit of a surprise, but immediately when I took it out of the box, for a 100 to 500 full frame lens, that's really quite compact. That's pretty small in the hands. Yes, it's an external zoom, right? So it gets longer as you zoom in. But actually, that's really quite hand-holdable. It's just going to fit in my bag without me really having to think about kind of moving things around to get a long lens in place. So really decent option as a telephoto lens. And part of that is that aperture, right? f5 to 7.1 is a little bit of a slower aperture, and probably immediately might be of a little bit of concern. Now, there are some other trade-offs that come with that. Generally speaking, a lens with an aperture like that will be a little bit cheaper as well. This is actually coming in, I think, at a pretty reasonable price, considering the kind of lens that we're talking about. So at launch, this is coming in at £1,799 in the UK, which I think for what you're getting here is actually a very reasonable price. But the biggest concern with an aperture like that, especially with a 100 to 500, where you will realistically be shooting probably faster moving subjects, right? So wildlife, sports, that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes these subjects are still, absolutely, in which case all good. But the concern is always going to be that if you're using a faster shutter speed, as well as having that slower aperture, you're going to have to bump that ISO up to ridiculous levels, and the whole photo is going to be noisy, and it's just not going to be great quality. And of course, I totally get it. That was actually my initial thought as well when I was kind of checking out the specs of the lens. So perfect. I had terrible weather, which meant I was able to go and check this out, not in super bright sunshine, not in like ideal conditions, but actually in quite overcast, cloud, rain, not ideal kind of light when you're talking about a slightly slower aperture, which I think is ideal because you kind of assume the lens is going to perform pretty well if there's lots of light. It's way more interesting to test this out with bad light. And I've been shooting with both a very fast shutter speed to see what that looks like, and also actually with a very slow shutter speed as well, all the way down to 1/50th of a second at, I think it's about 400mm, which is really interesting as well, because Panasonic say this has the best image stabilization for any lens that they've made, which is really quite a bold statement because they've got some fantastic image stabilization. I've got to say, handheld, this is so usable, and it was completely able to handle 1/50th of a second, handheld, shooting about 400mm, and I was able to get a nice, sharp shot. I was very pleased with that, because that means if you have a still subject, right, so it's not fast moving, you absolutely can bring that shutter speed down. That's going to be one way of combating that slightly slower aperture. But even if you are shooting at a higher shutter speed, these photos were all taken at around 1/2000th of a second. So something like 1/1600th or 1/2000th of a second, shooting between f5 and f7.1. And these are great. I think that these actually look fantastic. Part of that is that cameras now like the S1R II are able to handle higher ISO values. So I never really had to shoot over ISO 6400. And actually that was completely fine at getting enough light, actually making the photo correctly exposed. But also, I really wasn't dealing with noise. And I think that's an important consideration. Obviously, ideally, you would bring that ISO down. But I really didn't, honestly, these photos I think are fantastic in terms of optical quality. And that is something that the lens is able to deliver in spades. I think the images look fantastic from this lens. There's some lovely fall off and separation between subject and background, some lovely bokeh. I think it looks fantastic. The actual smoothness of those backgrounds, kind of out of focus areas is really, really lovely. So I'm a big fan of that. And it's nice and sharp as well when we're talking about our subjects. In terms of autofocus as well, this is absolutely keeping up no problem with birds in flight, with my dog running around, right? Wanted to use that with faster moving subjects, tracking the eye and the head of these animals to actually really try and put this through its paces, because that's what it's going to be used for, right? That is essentially what this lens is for. And it does a great job with that. It's actually a new optical image stabilization system in here. So it's a new dual side ball support. So there's no spring preload. And it's basically enhancing shake detection accuracy and improving responsiveness. And you can see a little video here that I took without the optical stabilization turned on the lens. So I had that turned off. And then this is with it turned on. You can see there is a massive difference. This is shot at, I think, about 500mm. So really trying to emphasize what this is like handheld. I had zero problems with this handheld shooting with the optical stabilization turned on. The truth is, I think a lot of us come from a time when lenses like this, you know, with f5 to 7.1 were going to be problematic in unfavorable lighting conditions, or maybe didn't have great stabilization. Whereas the truth is now cameras are just so able to deal with higher ISO values, and the stabilization is just so good that it kind of really mitigates the issue of those slower apertures. But, you know, let's talk about the actual design of the lens, because I think there's some pretty interesting things to touch on with this. The actual design, I think, is really nice in the way it actually controls, and it feels good in the hands. However, there is one thing I will mention, which is that the little tripod mount on the bottom here, you can unscrew this, and there's a little marker on here to set it for being kind of underneath the lens. You can also unscrew it and actually move it around. There's another marker to have it on the side, so that if you want to have the camera vertical on a tripod, you absolutely can. Super easy to make that happen, which is quite a nice little touch. What I will say is the actual gap between the tripod kind of mounting part here and the lens is just a bit tight for my hands. I found that whether I had it on the bottom or on the side, it was just a little bit uncomfortable. So probably what I'd do in that situation is, if I was going to use a handheld like that, I'd maybe move it over to something a bit weird like this. So it's off to the right, because that way my hand is now underneath the lens. I can control everything, and that's not hitting that tripod mounting part at all. So actually that is almost definitely what I would do to try and combat that problem. So I suppose actually now that I've talked about it, it's not actually that much of a problem, is it? If I can just do that. But it is probably worth noting, I've got reasonably sort of big fingers, big hands. Something to be aware of is that, you know, that, like I say, that gap, not particularly big. So, but there's ways to fix it. What you do have though is some pretty cool stuff. So a customizable ring at the front, of course, manual focus ring, but you can actually change that to control other things as well, which I think is quite cool. And a little smooth and tight ring here to change how that zoom ring is operating, whether it is smooth for kind of fast zooming or tight for more gradual control. I'll be totally honest with you, it didn't feel like it was making a massive amount of difference to the way it was controlling. You can kind of feel that it is slightly tighter when you set it to tight, but you know, and it might be this particular one. It's not making a huge amount of difference. It's not something really I would ever particularly think about after using the lens. And I'm not personally particularly bothered about it. I just think it's an interesting thing to note. It's a nice thing to have on there. I just don't know that it was doing that much for me personally. Otherwise, you've got the controls on the side here for things like focusing, autofocus, manual focus, and of course, that optical image stabilization mode as well, which is, like I say, super useful. I'll be honest with you, I think it's a fantastic option as a nice long telephoto zoom lens that's coming in at a pretty reasonable price for the kind of thing that you're getting here. A decent size as well, and pairs so nicely with something like the S1R II, the S1R II. You know, initially there might be some concerns, but I think that almost all of them are almost straight away mitigated by different things. It works really, really well with the new autofocus system, which I think is fantastic, because that's exactly what you want with a lens like this, where you are tracking faster moving subjects. And whether you're shooting photo or video, you've got a great option. Like I say, wildlife sports, this is going to be fantastic for that kind of stuff. You can check out the full spec. There's loads of stuff to look at here over on parkcameras.com, so you can check that out by following the link down in the description. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. There's new stuff all the time on the channel. I will see you in the next video. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.